Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in again to our weekly review Palestine this week with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, thank you as always for joining us to unpack the key stories from the past week.
And thanks for having me on again, Nasim. Always very good to be with you.
Yeah, let's kick off, Mouin, where we began last week. We began the review with a discussion about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is anything but that. And it's increasingly looking like some kind of a dystopian plan,
Yes.
or should I say, a dystopian aid trap for the Palestinians, designed to create chaos, mayhem, and advance Israel's main strategy and aim, which is to seize territory and ethnic cleanse Palestinians from their territory, from their home. So that's what it seems to be doing, and we saw on Sunday that more than 30 Palestinians were killed um, by Israeli soldiers. Of course, Israel denied that it had shot at the Palestinians starving to access aid in their usual manner, calling anyone who does so anti-Semitic and whatnot. So, what can we say, given that there's been so many reports, contrasting and also conflicting reports? What is the determination about what exactly happened on Sunday?
Well, as you correctly pointed out, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is anything but a Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It's an absolutely dystopian construct set up by the Israeli military in coordination with the US, whose main personnel are not humanitarian workers or people experienced in aid delivery, but rather are US mercenaries whose main experience is shooting and killing people in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And that's precisely why we have the situation that we have now in the southern Gaza Strip. What this what these characters have set up are distribution zones for very limited amounts of aid in the far south of the Gaza Strip, in the context now of 3 months of total siege of the Gaza Strip. And rather than delivering aid to a desperate population, they're telling this desperate population, if you want any food, if you want any water, if you want to continue to live, you have to come to us. You have to make the trek from Beit Lahia, from Qarara, from Khan Yunis, from Rafah to these aid distribution centers. And when these people arrive there, absolutely desperate, Israeli drones start announcing that there are only limited amounts of aid, and it will be made available on a first come, first served basis. And when, quite predictably, people start rushing these distribution centers, they start shooting them dead. So these aren't distribution centers, these are literally kill zones that are designed to bait people with desperately needed aid. And when they come to collect that aid, they're shot and killed. The first Witkoff massacre, as they're now being called, that took place in Rafah a few days ago, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which has set up a field hospital not too far from where this massacre took place, said it's the largest number of casualties they've received in a single day since their field hospital began operations approximately a year ago. So, to me, the only relevant question is whether these massacres are being conducted solely by the Israeli military or whether the American mercenaries who have established this arrangement so that these premeditated, deliberate massacres can occur, whether these American mercenaries are also playing a direct role in the killing of desperate Palestinian civilians. I don't have any evidence one way or the other, but I think at this stage we can safely assume um, that they are also in some way involved. Now, the other interesting aspect, of course, is that as with every other war crime that Israel has conducted since October 2023, and for that matter, for decades before, their initial response is that this is a blood libel. Nothing happened. No one was killed. There are no casualties. And then gradually, they began to change their story and say, actually, yes, something did happen. Yes, people were killed, but they were not killed by us. They were killed by Hamas. And it led, and the killings by Hamas directly led to the attack on the pro-Israel march in Boulder, Colorado. So, and of course, the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra in unison at the tap of the conductor immediately begins singing from the same hymn sheet. It's really incredible, that um, 2 years on, that Israel is still allowed to get airtime for its consistently disproven claims. And here again, you have Western media, the BBC, for example, seeking to finesse its reporting on this issue to ameliorate Israeli hurt feelings and so on. And then, of course, once they do so under pressure, the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra says, see, nothing ever happened because even the BBC is now changing its mind. Where, of course, it's, Rafi Berg and Tim Davie and its managers putting pressure on their correspondents to change the story. So an absolute disgrace, first and foremost, of course, in terms of the lives lost and the structures that were put in place to ensure that this would happen. Jeremy Konindik, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who's now the head of a prominent humanitarian organization and was previously a senior official at USAID, has described these massacres as 100% predictable, that it was inconceivable that anything else would happen than what we've seen on our television screen, precisely because of the way that this aid was structured. You bring desperately needed aid to desperate people, then you make sure there isn't enough for them, and then you make them basically compete with each other for the few crumbs you're tossing to them, and then you shoot them dead when they try to get this aid. And there are also videos, of these American mercenaries speaking with absolute contempt about the Palestinians who are waiting for these aid packages. These aren't humanitarian aid workers. These are criminals. These are killers. And of course, they should be held accountable. And speaking of being held accountable, just yesterday, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres once again refused to directly point the finger at Israel as a party responsible, and instead called for an independent, impartial investigation in which those responsible would be held accountable. Israel's response, of course, was not to say, we're convinced we had nothing to do with it, so we will do everything possible to facilitate this independent and impartial investigation. Rather, it started attacking Guterres, accusing his statement of being absolutely disgraceful. Why? Because he called for an investigation and called for accountability. That should tell you all you need to do. And if I can just make one last point, Israel's strategy in these situations is not to convince you that their version of events is right. It's primarily to put out a sufficiently large volume of misinformation and disinformation and reports to divert you from what's happening and so on, to sow doubt. They're not seeking to convince, they're seeking to confuse. And once people like you and me start saying, well, it looks like there was a massacre, but we can't really be sure. We need to look into this further, but unfortunately, Israel is preventing journalists from entering the Gaza Strip and so on. So we're going to have to withhold judgment until later. As far as Israel is concerned, it's mission accomplished.
I mean, it needs to be mentioned that nearly every single one of the most egregious claims by Israel has turned out to be false over the past 19 months, whether it be the bombing of Al-Ahle Baptist Hospital,
Yeah.
Al-Shifa Hospital, which was supposed to be some kind of a command center. It didn't turn out to be the case. More recently, the killing of health personnel, the ambulances workers. And if you go back further, Shireen Abu Akleh, in every single one of those crimes, Israel first denied it, and then, of course, it turned out to be the case that Israel was guilty of perpetrating those crimes and assaults. And with regards to the humanitarian Gaza humanitarian institution, whatever it's called. I think the apt description is to call it the Gaza humanitarian aid trap. That's what it seems to
Exactly.
be exactly, which is to entice Palestinians to the south and then put them in a narrow concentration camp, in eventually hoping to force them out. And we shouldn't delude ourselves, I guess, because Netanyahu said right at the outset that the intention was not, he wasn't motivated by humanitarian concern. He was motivated by his allies in Washington and elsewhere saying, look, we cannot support you if we see images of starving babies. And that is what motivated Netanyahu. But even then, I don't think enough aid, as you pointed out, is going through. And another thing that needs to be, I guess, nipped in the bud here, which again was used to justify Israel bypassing all the humanitarian institution and setting up this aid trap, was this idea that somehow Hamas was looting aid, and therefore Israel had to intervene because the international organizations were failing to do that. I think we need to kind of debunk that, because over the past week, it turns out that the criminal gangs who have been authorized and
Important
also
point.
defended by Israeli soldiers are the ones who are carrying out the looting. Why? It seems because, again, to continue starving the Palestinians. If they loot the humanitarian aid, less and less goes to the Palestinians. On the one hand, you're showing we're delivering aid, but on the other hand, the same aid is being looted by criminal gangs you've empowered to kind of man those concentration camps. So I think we
Yes,
need
I
to
mean,
debunk that.
yeah, exactly. And as we discussed last week, every major humanitarian official has stated explicitly that these accusations that Hamas is looting the aid in order to feed its own fighters and sell the aid at inflated prices to Palestinian civilians is simply not true. But the accusation keeps being made over and over again, as if it's demonstrably, definitively proven on multiple occasions. But there is
Can I
simply,
just add another name to this?
yes,
So disturbing. David Satterfield. He was Joe Biden's humanitarian envoy, and he's very staunch pro-Israeli. He was on. He gave an interview last week. He came out and said there is no evidence that Hamas is stealing aid, as Netanyahu and others claim. Sorry to interrupt you there.
yeah, no, you're right. But I'd just like to address one point of regarding what you just said, which I fully agree with. But you used the term Israel bypassing aid agencies. I think it's actually more pernicious than that. What Israel is engaged in is an effort to seize the aid effort from the specialized professional international humanitarian aid agencies in order to control and weaponize aid in order to actually reduce dramatically rather than increase the volume of aid that is available so that exactly as you said, it can lure these people to the southern Gaza Strip, lure them into these death traps, which have become kill zones, and set the stage for their mass expulsion outside the Gaza Strip. Is that the plan? Well, Israeli leaders have told us explicitly that that's why they're doing this. So why should we doubt them? For once, it appears they're actually capable of telling the truth.
Let's turn our attention again to another I would say, sinister, pernicious event, which is
There's no
related
shortage of
to,
them, apparently.
yes, Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy. He, as we all know, has been negotiating a ceasefire deal between Hamas and Israel. Now, there are mixed stories about that. There's competing claims, competing documents as to who said what and what was signed by Hamas and what was signed by Israel. But the bottom line, as I see it, seems to be that Hamas wants a pathway to Israel's genocidal war in exchange for the release of hostages, whereas Israel does not want that, and that seems to be the Gordian knot which even Steve Witkoff is unable to, untie. So, I mean, is that how you see it? And what has been the role of Steve Witkoff in what many describe as a sinister and deceptive role he's played over the past week, as some have said?
Well, let's first establish that it is Steve Witkoff and no one else. It's not Marco Rubio or Adam Buehler or any of these other characters who are who have this file within their mandate. So if you're talking about efforts to reach an agreement in the Gaza Strip, at least as far as the U.S. angle is concerned, it's Steve Witkoff is the one in charge. Now, this is someone who, as you know, earned considerable credit in January for compelling Israel to reach a ceasefire, something that the Biden administration had systematically refused to do since October 2023. And then there were several incidents, which we've discussed previously, where Witkoff basically went back on his word and double-crossed Hamas, abrogated agreements that they had already agreed to, and that set the stage for the issues we've been discussing during the past 2 months, particularly the unprecedented siege on the Gaza Strip and the intensification of the genocide, particularly in the northern Gaza Strip. Now, at the same time, negotiations have continued, not directly between the United States and Hamas, though there are reports that some additional direct meetings may have been held, which I can't confirm, but certainly indirectly. On the one hand, through the Egyptian and Qatari mediators, and on the other, through this Palestinian American Republican, Bishara Bahbah, who has been serving as a messenger between Hamas and the Trump administration. And last week, or the week before, this resulted in a framework agreement, which was accepted by both the United States and the Palestinians. Shortly thereafter, two of Netanyahu's senior envoys, I think he's the Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, and another one whose name I forget, visited Washington. After they left, all of a sudden, Witkoff came back with a different framework than the one he had agreed with Hamas. And there's some confusion about why this happened. My suspicion, although I can't prove it, is that at this meeting in Washington, the Americans informed the Israelis that the Americans believed that they were very close to signing an agreement with Iran, of concluding an agreement with Iran. And the Israelis, of course, oppose any agreement with Iran. The only agreement that the Israelis will accept is one between the US and Israel to launch a war against Iran. And it seems that in order to mollify the Israelis, the Americans accepted a number of fundamental revisions to the framework document that Witkoff had produced. And the most important change was to remove any explicit reference to a definitive end to Israeli military operations in the Gaza Strip and a full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and an unrestricted flow of aid into the Gaza Strip. Witkoff sent this back to Hamas. Hamas convened a meeting with the other Palestinian movements in the Gaza Strip, and they collectively responded to Witkoff, apparently in a rather respectful tone, in which they went out of their way to say that they were not rejecting, they were not categorically rejecting his new document, that they still accepted the framework in principle, but needed to see amendments that included explicit guarantees that this framework would result in a definitive end to military operations and a definitive, comprehensive, full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and so on. Now, some people would call that a rejection, others would call it an insistence on returning to what had been agreed upon. Others would say, well, they were seeking amendments to the document rather than rejecting it. Be that as it may, Witkoff then went public and said that the changes that Hamas had communicated to the Americans were completely unacceptable. Very bellicose statement that Witkoff made. What does this mean? Does this mean that the US is basically withdrawing from this process and is no longer interested in seeing these negotiations concluded, and therefore will revert to letting Israel have its merry way with the Gaza Strip and, for that matter, the West Bank? Is this a pressure tactic to see if the Palestinians will buckle under US-Israeli pressure? That we don't really know yet. I assume that at some stage the Americans will re-engage and will come to the realization that on these fundamental issues, the Palestinians are unlikely to blink first, and that unless an agreement has explicit guarantees for an end to the war and so on, then the Palestinians won't sign on to it. And there's an important issue here, which is that Witkoff generated quite a lot of goodwill in the region, and even among Palestinians, and even among Hamas early on during his period of engagement. But because he is seen as having double crossed the Palestinians once too often since January, his room for maneuver has been very significantly restricted. The kind of what they call constructive ambiguity that would normally help seal such agreements. There's much less room for that than there would have been a month or two ago, because the Palestinians, quite understandably, are now going to insist that Witkoff not only spell out exactly what's going to happen, but also provide guarantees that what is agreed actually is going to be implemented, something they may have been much more flexible about if they didn't feel that Witkoff has repeatedly double-crossed them.
Mm. I mean, there was so much goodwill towards Witkoff. I think there was at one point he was called a Qatari asset by
Yes.
a member of the Israeli Hasbara Symphony
Yes,
Orchestra, which you
Witkoff is
described.
Hamas and all the rest of it.
Yeah, all the rest of it. But what have you made of this extraordinary claim that, revelation that Hamas agreed to surrendering control to a technocratic Palestinian government as part of that deal. But it was Israel who removed this as a condition for a ceasefire negotiation. So now many have interpreted that to mean that Israel is seeking to keep Hamas in power to continue justifying its ongoing assault and ongoing genocide in Gaza. I mean, that would not, I mean, as much as it may sound counterintuitive, I mean, Netanyahu was propping up Hamas, and Israel has always claimed that, we don't have any partner for peace for many, many decades. And in this scenario, you can see why it would be in the interest of Israel to keep Hamas in power, to justify what it's doing on the ground. If Hamas wasn't there, then there is no need to continue the ongoing genocide. So what have you made of that part of the negotiation?
Well, Hamas, approximately a year ago, I think, in the context of negotiations with its Palestinian rivals in the Fatah movement. So let's call them negotiations also between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, agreed to relinquish governance and power and office in the Gaza Strip. In other words, that in any post war scenario, should one arise, Hamas would no longer be responsible for appointing and running the government and administration of the Gaza Strip. I suspect that from Hamas's point of view, first of all, they didn't want, the insurmountable responsibilities of reconstruction, because if they were still in government, no one would deal with them, and reconstruction assistance and so on would be very severely hampered. And second of all, they probably also believe, that with their Qassam brigades remaining operational, that in a critical moment they could exercise their power informally, so they didn't need to be formally in control. That agreement was then effectively vetoed by the Palestinian Authority leader, Mahmoud Abbas, who is not only kind of viscerally opposed to Hamas as a movement under any and all circumstances, but also, I think, didn't want to be seen by his American and other Western sponsors as having accepted any agreement with Hamas, even one that in which Hamas relinquished office in the Gaza Strip. So I think that explains the Palestinian angle of things. Why did so? And then, as you point out, what happened in these negotiations is that there was a this framework agreement that was reached between the Americans and Hamas, mentioned, that Hamas would not play a role in post-war governance and administration. The version that was then agreed between Witkoff and the Israelis removed this clause, and Hamas tried to reinsert it, something which Witkoff then said was totally unacceptable. I think Israel's perspective, and this goes back to 2007, so almost 2 decades ago. Israel, of course, has no love for Hamas, and ideally would like to see Hamas, along with all other Palestinian movements, disappear. But given the realities that exist, Israel's priority is Palestinian fragmentation, Palestinian division. So even though you have a Palestinian Authority in the West Bank that is effectively subservient to Israel and its agenda of occupation and annexation, Israel would rather have two separate authorities governing the West Bank and the Gaza Strip than a unified one. And Israel's fear was that if Hamas is no longer playing a formal role in governance and administration in the Gaza Strip, that this would be a prelude to the unification of governance and administration in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And avoiding that is an even greater priority for Israel than seeking to remove Hamas governance in the Gaza Strip. You'll remember that already beginning in October 2023, Israel proclaimed eradicating the ability of Hamas to govern the Gaza Strip as one of its war aims. Well, now we find out that that's about as important to Israel as obtaining the release of its captives, because its real priorities, of course, are genocide and ethnic cleansing. So, in a sense, seen in historical perspective, nothing particularly new here. And once again, as with these Witkoff massacres that we've spoken about, Israel does something once, and when it gets away with it, it becomes normalized and it begins doing it routinely. We've now had, I believe, 3 Witkoff massacres in the space of 3 days. And unfortunately, there are probably many more to come, because you have news organizations like the BBC now saying, well, we really don't know what happened. We'll have to investigate further. You have someone like the Secretary General of the United Nations demanding an impartial, independent investigation, which of course there should be. But pretending he doesn't have a clue what happened either. That normalizes things. That sets the stage for their repetition.
I think our next story, we should um, I think we should connect it with our previous conversation about Hamas seeking to surrender power and seeking different arrangement with the Palestinian Authority taking over, um, and and this is related to, I guess, Israel's preventing Arab foreign ministers from going to the occupied West Bank and meeting with the Palestinian Authority. And the meeting was meant to discuss the future of Gaza, the future of Palestine, two-state solution. And as you just pointed out, I think in the eyes of Israel, a legitimate Palestinian authority, Palestinian government is an existential threat to Israel because it paves a pathway to a two-state solution, and Israel does not want that, which is, I think, one of the main reasons why Israel prevented the foreign ministers of the UAE, Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia from going to the occupied West Bank, and also let's also introduce this aspect of the development, which is that next month, well, this month actually, later this month, there will be a meeting at the UN by the Saudis and the French discussing a pathway to a two-state solution. So it seems to be that Israel's doing everything it can to prevent any discussion, any negotiation for a two-state solution. So is that how you see this development as well?
Yes, primarily so. This delegation of states of delegations from states that have formal relations with Israel and of a few states that have informal relations with Israel, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, was planning to go to Ramallah to meet with the Palestinian Authority leadership to discuss these issues of primarily how to strengthen the PA and ensure that it is in charge of the Gaza Strip in any post-genocide scenario, and also this upcoming conference. Now, Israel, on the one hand, claims that it wants nothing more than normalization with Saudi Arabia, but on the other hand, will do absolutely nothing to promote normalization with Saudi Arabia. I mean, do the Israelis really expect that after Israel saying that it will maintain its occupation of the West Bank forever, and that the only change that's going to come in the West Bank is formal Israeli annexation, that it is building 22 new settlements in the West Bank, precisely in order to prevent the prospect of an end to occupation in a Palestinian state by constantly invading the Haram al-Sharif, with senior ministers in charge in the lead, by preventing a Saudi diplomatic delegation from traveling to Ramallah. Do the Israelis really believe that this is somehow promoting normalization with Saudi Arabia, that this is somehow whetting Riyadh's appetite for normalization with Israel? Of course not. Now, as far as this conference is concerned, it's international conference co-hosted by France and Saudi Arabia, and the headline here is seeking to that France has indicated that it is seriously considering recognizing Palestinian statehood, and other European governments may be doing so as well. I'm not so sure that's going to happen. The Israelis have already launched an all-out onslaught on France, together with the Americans, who are now sending official warnings, apparently, to the British and the French not to do so. I have my doubts about whether this is going to happen. But even if it does, um, to recognize a Palestinian state in 2025, almost 6 decades after the occupation of 1967 commenced, and given everything that has happened to totally fundamentally transform these territories in the intervening 6 decades, to now simply issue a statement that you recognize a Palestinian state which is being wiped out before our very eyes on a daily basis. Is that politically symbolic, even politically significant? Um, yes, it is. Is it morally symbolic and significant? Yes, it is. Does it have any practical value? None whatsoever. If we're only talking about a formal statement of recognition, which is not accompanied by very specific, concrete, detailed measures to ensure the state can actually begin to exercise effective sovereignty over its territory. And the only way to do that is to ensure that Israel's grip on these territories, that its occupation is, in the words of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion of last July, ended as rapidly as possible. And so far, we've seen absolutely no indication that these European states, and for that matter, Arab states, are prepared to impose any consequences on Israel for its conduct. They talk about if Israel doesn't, begin allowing humanitarian aid and so on, there will be consequences. Never once have they informed the Israelis about exactly what consequences there will be if Israel does not alter its behavior. And in such a situation, these statements are not only meaningless, they become worse than meaningless because what they actually do is they serve as camouflage, as a diversion, as effectively a verbal charade um, uh, to divert attention from the absolute inertia and refusal to take any meaningful action by these governments in question.
Yeah, let's also mention that 20 new illegal settlements were announced last week, since our last conversation.
Yes.
And I guess what would a meaningful action look like? I mean, there was a discussion I was listening to over the week, and one of the ideas is that every single trade agreement with Israel should be conditioned on doing everything that's required for the creation of a two-state solution. There's no point, as you said, issuing statements and support unless there's concrete action. And one example of that would be to have every single, whether it be European Israel trade negotiations or the just bilateral agreements between separate countries, Arab countries as well, unless their agreements is conditioned on ending settlements or anything that Israel does which prevents the pathway of the creation of the Palestinian state, that should be completely stopped unless there are concrete requirements like that. It's meaningless, as you say. So there has to be that. I guess that is kind of what a concrete step would look like. But we are nowhere near seeing that kind of action being taken, whether it be UK, France, or any of the Arab countries for that matter, who have normalized relationships with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, relations between Europe and Israel are so deep, are so intimate, are so multidimensional and multifaceted that the options available to impose concrete consequences on Israel are literally limitless. Everything from suspending or renouncing, abrogating these trade agreements to banning the access of illegal products from illegal settlements, banning their access to the European market, from preventing Israeli airliners access to European airspace, to supporting efforts to have Israel banned from international sports federations and so on. I mean, the relations are so deep and intimate and expansive that Europe could, the possibilities here, as I said before, are literally limitless. And what's so notable is that not a single one of these consequences has ever been seriously considered by the Europeans because the direction of travel has always been business as usual. Oh, you're building 22 new settlements? Business as usual. Oh, you're committing genocide in the Gaza Strip? Here, have some more arms. So we cannot put faith in these governments. Sure, they're constantly talking about international law and all the rest of it, but they will only change their conduct under pressure from their own citizens or
Mm,
from other valuable international partners, like the Arab states. But we don't see that happening anytime soon either.
mm. Let's switch gears for a bit and turn our attention to the Gaza Freedom Flotilla. There's a number of famous people on board. Greta Thunberg is one of a number of people there. Um, and the response has been, again, quite maniacal. I mean, you have someone like Lindsey Graham, who's basically threatened to sink the boat or wishing that the boat is sunk. And others saying all kinds of things. And I think when I see that, it also makes you wonder what is it, um, what would one do if they believed that a genocide was being committed, and um, and I think you do the at the very least you do is stand up if you think your country is supporting genocide, your university is supporting genocide, you'd stand up at a university during some and then condemn your country for that. And I'm speaking here of Mera Vamuri, who spoke at the
At
MIT.
MIT, huh?
And then there was a whole tirade of attack on her by, as you call them, Israeli flunkies, saying, "Oh, she's a narcissist, she's this, she's that." But then you ask, if you believe there's a genocide taking place and your country is complicit in that genocide, uh, what would you do? That's the least you would do. Someone like Greta Thunberg, the least she feels she could do is get on a flotilla and sail towards Gaza, raising the profile and highlighting the issue. That's the least you would do. But it seems like a lot of these guys, um, I think I don't know what moral compass they have to say such things to Greta and the colleagues she's with on the Freedom Flotilla, and also someone like Mera Vamuri, who deeply, I think, sincerely believes there's a genocide going on, and there is every evidence to believe there is a genocide going on, and America is complicit, and her university is complicit in that, and you're morally obliged to do something about it. So, yeah, over
Yeah,
to
I
you.
mean, this extraordinarily courageous MIT student who simply, had the courage to state the obvious, not only what's happening, but the complicity of her own institution in what's happening, which, by the way, activists are increasingly doing, of focusing not only on what's happening in the Middle East, but also focusing on what's happening much closer to home. She was banned from attending her own graduation. This Freedom Flotilla, with Greta Thunberg, Liam Cunningham, the well-known actor from Game of Thrones, and others. Yes, you have senior U.S. senators who know full well what happened with the Mavi Marmara, which was a previous attempt to deliver aid to Israel, which was attacked by armed Israeli force in international waters with 10 people shot to death. They know the background exactly, and they're basically demanding a repeat performance. And then you have, let's look at something much more innocent. There's a woman in the United States who goes by the name of Miss Rachel, who has basically dedicated her life and professional career to children. And I think she makes, YouTube videos for toddlers and so on. She has done nothing more than show empathy for the children of Gaza. She's never made a political statement about this issue at all. And she is being now vilified around the clock for weeks on end solely for the crime of having the gall to express empathy with Palestinian children in the Gaza Strip. That is how to use your word, maniacal. It's mass hysteria. It's total mass hysteria. Now, of course, then you will get people like Jonathan Greenblatt of the Defamation League saying, well, it's important to distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel and illegitimate criticism, which is anti-Semitism and so on. No, that's smoke and mirrors, because for these people, legitimate criticism of Israel does not exist. Every and any criticism of Israel is by definition illegitimate because it is criticism of Israel. You cannot criticize, you can't even show empathy for a 4-year-old Palestinian who has lost both legs without being vilified by the Hasbara Philharmonic Orchestra and its genocide choir around the clock for weeks on end. It is, it is out of this world. And one day, to be sure, there will be a reckoning. Whether you're going after this Miss Rachel or openly calling for piracy in international waters, or any of the other stuff. No, criticism of Israel is legitimate. Criticism of Israeli policy is legitimate. Calling for the dismantlement of this irrational genocidal apartheid regime is not only legitimate, it is moral, and it has become necessary.
I think there is a contradiction between the opinion people hold when they're in office and the opinion the
Let me guess
honesty
where
they
this is
find,
going.
honesty they find after they leave office. So I think that there is being in office does something to people's ability to morally judge a situation as honestly as possible. And I think we saw an example of that just 2 days ago. We're recording this on Tuesday, the 3rd of June. Matthew Miller, who was
Count Dracula.
yeah, Biden's former official at the Biden
He was a
administration.
State Department spokesman, I think.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. So he was literally the face of covering up for Israel's genocide in Gaza under the Biden administration. We all remember him for the strange smile, the glee he seems to have had in defending Israel's genocidal
Oh, he
atrocities in
loved,
Gaza.
loved,
Yeah.
loved his job. And the part of his job he loved most was defending and promoting Israeli genocide. That was the best part of his job as far as he was concerned. He
Yeah. So he came
absolutely
out.
loved it.
Yeah, and he came out and he said that he believes that without doubt, and I'm quoting here, without doubt, Israel is committing war crimes. And he said that in an interview with Sky. And it was quite an astonishing thing to say, having been for over a year the face of Israel's genocide in Gaza in Washington, for him to now say, I'm saying this in my personal capacity when he was challenged, but when he was in office, he had to represent the US and the US position, and the US had not made a determination that Israel was committing war crimes. So now going back to the question I was asking earlier, there seems to be a huge, gaping gap between the position someone holds in office, their ability to justify genocide, all kinds of war crimes, and once they leave, they somehow find this new lens through which uh, they're able to see honestly exactly what is happening on the ground.
Look, Matt Miller is such a morally compromised and thoroughly depraved individual. And since leaving his position has become so meaningless and insignificant, that I don't think it's worth paying attention to anything he says, particularly because in the statement you refer to, he once again tried to make the case that it's only war crimes and not genocide. I'll only say one thing about this, and I think that's already one thing too many. Um, when he was challenged, as you point out, about, why are you saying this now? His response was essentially, well, I was following orders. You know, how has that worked out in the past? People have swung for the gallows for making that argument in defense of their participation in genocide, and that's really all I have to say about this thoroughly morally compromised, utterly depraved, and now thankfully meaningless individual.
Mm. We won't say anymore, and let's end our conversation with the conclusion of the Sarajevo Declaration of the Gaza Tribunal, which ended on 29th of May. Uh, the statement they issued was for the de-Zionization of the State of Israel and of its end of its racial domination. And they went on to say that Israel presents an existential threat to the rules-based international system. And I guess the question I want to ask you before we end our conversation today, first, what was your takeaway from the tribunal? Many of our viewers will not know what that tribunal was, three-day tribunal. And also, will Israel become synonymous with the end of the rules-based international order?
Well, the Sarajevo Declaration is the result of an initiative known as the Gaza Tribunal, and I've spoken to some of the participants, and basically it takes its inspiration from an initiative in the 1960s, which was known as the Russell Tribunal. It was established at the time by the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell in order to shine a spotlight on the US war against Vietnam at a time when neither the international community nor international legal institutions were capable of fulfilling their obligations to bring the horrific atrocities to an end. And so it was not a formally constituted initiative. It didn't have actual any kind of executive power, if you will. It wasn't able to implement decisions, but it possessed enormous moral force and political relevance. And that model has been copied over the years by other initiatives. So, for example, including in the Middle East. So, for example, after the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the Sabra Shatila massacres, you had an initiative known as the McBride Commission, which was something similar. And there have been others, both in the region and elsewhere. The Gaza Tribunal seeks to achieve something very similar. It seeks to bring together leading luminaries from the fields of international law and other relevant fields to produce a whole series of specialized documents showing exactly the enormity of the crime and the atrocity that is now happening against the Palestinian people, showing it to expose its depth and roots, and thereby seek to generate popular pressure upon governments, upon international institutions, upon the international community to act more effectively to bring this atrocity to an end. That it is in that context that the Sarajevo Declaration has been drafted and issued. And this was not the end of the Gaza Tribunal, if I'm not mistaken. It's still an ongoing initiative whose work is continuing. And regarding the statement you asked about, this was by the noted human rights activist Noura Arakat that Gaza.
Israel will become synonymous with the end of the
Yes,
rules-based order.
yes, and I think it's spot on. It's right on target for two reasons. First of all, Israel's conduct itself is somehow managing to violate every single principle and norm and value upon which international law is based, and particularly as it has developed since 1945. But just as importantly, and arguably even more importantly, Israel is being consistently empowered by the world's leading advocates of international law, purported advocates of international law, I should say, to continue doing exactly what it is doing. And their main efforts are not to ensure that Israeli conduct is somehow brought into compliance with international law, but rather to bully, to intimidate, to punish anyone, any government, any institution that seeks to bring Israel's conduct into compliance with international law. So, under the kind of twin assault of Israel's shredding of the rule book and the United States and its European allies seeking to shred anyone who's still devoted to the international rule book, I think Noura Harakat's observation was unfortunately right on target.
Thanks, Mouin. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, joining me, Nasim Ahmed, for our weekly review of Palestine this week. I look forward to our conversation next week, and thank you for tuning in. See you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Nasim, and see you next week.